Welcome. You're listening to Sons and Kings, the Psalm 2 show where we unlock the church's ancient battle cry of divine filiation and embrace the gentle kingship of Christ through the riches of the Christian tradition. Happy Tuesday. Let's begin. Sons and Kings, the Psalm 2 show, here as always with Pat and Lewis. We are wrapping up our discussion here of verse 8. So one final time, Pat.
Ask of me, and I will give you the Gentiles for your inheritance, and the utmost parts of the earth for your possession.
Awesome. So we kind of get in a little bit into this last time, but I think today we just want to dive into how does this verse fit in with everything that we've heard so far?
Yeah, I like recontextualizing some of these verses. You know, we do these deep dives on the individual verses, but I think it's also very helpful to zoom out and see how the psalm is fitting together. And this verse makes me think of inheriting the earth makes me think of the Beatitude, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And meekness as kind of the path to the promise in this verse of inheriting the utmost parts of the earth as our possession. And that's in contrast to the initial verses of the psalm, the Gentiles who rage, the opposite of meekness, and the kings who conspire, the opposite of this kind of humility and meekness, and plotting, this plotting for power is the opposite of that. And so this verse kind of through the Beatitude is reapplied as kind of a rebuttal of those figures from the first two verses of the psalm, that meekness and kind of identity as a son of God is what leads to true inheritance, not the rage, not the vain things, not the plots, but instead meekness as the virtue for winning the world for God and inheriting it as our true possession as Christians.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things too is when we think about the Psalms are special in the sense that they reference, like the story of David often. They're written by David. They're kind of speaking about David, the conqueror, the king, the soldier. And also, you compare him to like an image of some other kings. He's also kind of meek. He's extremely prayerful. He's, even if you think about when he's kind of combating Saul in that whole saga, he's like super meek and kind of like always deferring to like Saul, the anointed one, God's will. He's not trying to seize it for himself, plot. He's not scheming at all. He's like the anti-schemer. He's like constantly trying to like say, I'm not scheming against you, Saul. Like I'm truly. And so even in how God gives him the inheritance, it's like through his prayer, his meekness. And again, we see that as he's a type of Christ. Christ, who is the person who this is truly referencing as inheriting the Gentiles truly, and who truly inherits the whole earth as his possession. Christ conquers through his meekness, through his prayerfulness, and he doesn't have to go to the mountain and pray. Spend that time early in the morning in prayer. He even says it during when he's raising Lazarus from the dead, he's like, Father, I do this not for the sake of you, but for their sake, that they may hear me basically pray to you and recognize the importance of this. So he doesn't necessarily need to do that in a way, but it also demonstrates to us that that prayer, right, for us, that is the place, that interior life is where the works and the actions kind of overflow from, right, in the human conquering, if you will. In the life of David, he's obviously writing the Psalms, praying, and from that, his kind of kingship flourishes. And so for us in our kind of apostolic works, we have to not just focus on the actions. We have to focus also on the interiority, the prayer, following the type of David that this psalm is referencing, following out in the footsteps of Christ our Lord, who is God himself, but also fully man in his template that he set. And so I just want to reference a quote from Saint Josemaría in The Way, and he has this quote, it's, your apostolic life is worth only as much as your prayer. And then again, in a letter that Don Alvaro, one of his successors also wrote, connected to this apostolic work, my daughters and sons, deepen your union with our Lord, the only guarantee of success in apostolic work. He has overcome the world, and he will make us share in his triumph if we have a strong piety. And then he says, going forward, if our prayer is shown in deeds, that is, if it leads to generous sacrifice and can be discerned in the rectitude of of our behavior and unity of life if we do not let up in our daily effort to live in the presence of God. And so I just think like when we think about conquering, even in our apostolic works, like trying to go forward and encounter others, it overflows from this prayer, from this interiority, from this meekness. And that's kind of the disposition that we have to have.
Yeah, absolutely. That reminds me of what we were discussing on a previous episode here on verse 8, really talking about the ask, right? And the ask of Christ and Christ's inheritance of the world. And what you're talking about is really reminding me of Aquinas's commentary on this verse. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "It is God who works in us to will and to accomplish, and thus he wills so that we may receive gifts by beseeching and praying. He wanted to show this example through Christ because he wanted him to beseech that which belonged to him by right of heredity." And then he goes on and he says, "This supplication on behalf of Gentiles can be understood in a twofold way. First, through prayer, because he prays on their behalf, i.e., John 17, not for them only do I pray, but for them also who through their word shall believe in me. And second, through passion, i.e., in Hebrews 9, that by means of his death, for the redemption of those transgressions which were under the former testament." St. Thomas Aquinas, when he's putting this verse in the context of Christ, the redemption of the world, how he won the world from sin through the cross, we're seeing that this emphasis on two things. He says prayer and the passion. And I think we as Christians really live out our apostolic life uh, through prayer and mortification, both active and passive, embracing of the little crosses of every day, really embracing a spirit of penance and letting that be the thing that really drives any action. We see, something needs to be done, or like, hey, we cannot omit this action by virtue of justice to a family member, a neighbor, a colleague, and so we want to like kind of go out and encounter them for Christ. That has to be built on that foundation of prayer and mortification.
And just to put a cap on that, um,
Please.
in Philippians, St. Paul has a verse that I think speaks to this fact that, it's prayer and going to God and having that unity of God that's in the first place. And then everything flows from that. Give you a good version here to quote, "For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." God's working in us first. Any good thing that we do, it's really God working through us for that good thing. We in ourselves can't really do anything good apart from God. Christ is very clear about this in the gospel where he says, without me, you can do nothing. I mean, it can't be any more clear than that. And so I think sometimes we can, you think about these kings, right? They're like, there's in the first verse, they're zealous to conquer. They're like, in our own strength, we're going to accomplish, we're going to get it, we're going to take it. And I think sometimes, reflecting how it applies to ourselves, like sometimes in our apostolic life in the things that we're trying to accomplish in the world, even in our workplaces, we can just be like, I'm gonna conquer, I'm taking over, I'm doing whatever. We can have this spirit of like get-to-itiveness, which is not bad, right? Ambition in a sense can be good, but we have to remember if we're apart from Christ, none of our efforts will have that supernatural fruit that they need to really have any meaning, to really be good in the true sense. And that also means like when we're encountering others, when we're trying to have, those good relationships with the quote unquote Gentile, these people who may not have a relationship with Christ, when we're trying to do that inheritance, that quote unquote conquering, that only comes through that relationship with Christ and through God working in us and through us. We have to always remind ourselves that comes first. Fall in that template of Christ. Just as in the quotes you read, like that's what we see as the template laid. He's praying, he's beseeching the Father. Like we have to do that on a regular basis, and we have to recognize apart from him, we can't do anything.
Yeah, it makes me wonder how meekness is a virtue associated with prayer. And I think we've been doing that a lot in this episode to say being meek is kind of embodied in the life of prayer. And that's how you really win apostles. And that just made me think that I think even if we're in a regular habit of being prayer, maybe sometimes it's not meek. And I think this verse is it's challenging in a way because we're we're being commanded to ask for our inheritance. Ask of me, and I will give you the Gentiles for your inheritance. And we talked about the importance of the ask. This kind of we need to be kind of demanding in our prayer and say, "This is what I want. This is what I need." and we demand that. But then also we need to be meek in prayer, and that's, I think, also important to add that we should have an agenda and have, oh yes, I have all these things I need to take care of. And I think sometimes, in my prayer, it's so focused on like, okay, how do I get a solution as quick as possible to this problem? Lord, give me insight, and I think I would benefit from more meekness in my prayer to say, okay, what I really want is just to be open to anything that you have to suggest, if that makes sense. And there's kind of that importance of remaining meek in prayer in addition to kind of being demanding, and how to balance those two. I don't know. This verse, I don't know. It's challenging for me in that way.
Yeah, man. You really make me think of Saint Josemaria's homily, "A Sign of Interior Life." It's a meditation he gave, and you can find it in Dialogue with the Lord. And it's very striking because he's kind of just meditating on some of the persecution that he himself experienced. And he calls it like the persecution of the good. He said from good people,
Mm.
like that, in theory, like you should have like, these are brother apostles. Why are they persecuting me? Why aren't they trying to understand what we're doing? He says, after I die, you can break the silence I have kept for so long and shout and shout. Yeah. And in Spanish, it's sometimes translated scream. But he says, and shout and shout. I've had to keep silent for years and years. Among my papers, you will find exhortations to prudence, to silence, to overcoming difficulties with prayer and mortification, with humility, with work, and with deeds, and not just with the tongue. There's something that kept me from speaking, something that led me to be silent, and is related to the whole preface that I have been making. It's something that is not really mine, but a grace from God our Lord. And in the preface, and then what he gets into next in this is he's meditating on divine filiation. And he says, I've never been alone. This is the thing that made me keep silent in the face of things that were objectively intolerable. And so when you're talking about meekness, Pat, and even though he says like you can break the silence and shout, between the lines there is like an invitation to also keep silent, to also practice this meekness. It's like, things are objectively intolerable. You could create a scandal if you want to, but what is that going to accomplish? Is it really going to accomplish the things you think it's going to accomplish? Between those lines, even though he's saying that, like, you know, when I pray about this, it's an invitation to participate in that meekness that we see that our Lord exercised and Saint Josemaría exercised, and to not take what we think is going to be the easy road, but take the humble road.
And with that, I immediately thought about, in both what you were saying, what Pat was saying, I thought about the Magnificat. When Mary in Luke chapter 1, he says, he has cast down the mighty from their thrones, lifted up the lowly, and filled the hungry with good things, while the rich he has sent away empty. I just think exactly about that contrast between people in verse 1 and then the people who inherit in verse 8, or Christ. And you just see that this theme is really like, it's kind of the divine economy of reality. Like it's obviously taught the Sermon on the Mount, it's taught in the Beatitudes, it's taught here in the Magnificat, it's taught in the Old Testament. And so you can see it's a truth that it is in the meekness, in that openness to God, that receptivity to God, that awareness of God's presence and his continual support, the reliance on him and not our own strength, that we overcome. And it takes trust. It takes true trust. I even think about when St. Josemaría is going through the persecutions that he went through of these priests and these, others, people who are these good individuals, you could say. He's going through persecution, slanders, and things like that. Just that awareness, though, that God is with me. Like, God is supporting me, and I can be quiet and I can take this in prayer and mortification because I know God is leading this. I know God is guiding me. And with that support in our own lives, if we can have that same sense, because God is with us also. If we stay close to him in prayer and we stay close to him, then we can go out in our workplace, in a very difficult workplace with extreme opposition, or even just in the difficulties of family life and the difficulties of trying to talk to somebody that, it's just been difficult to try to get them to find any interest in what we have to say. And we're like, is God with me in this? Yeah, he is, actually.
Yeah.
And in fact, like in that constant prayer and that constant closeness to him, like even if what may have seemed like an apparent failure, even on its face, is not a failure. We know that that's the economy of the cross.
Right.
Even in the quote unquote failure of that person not hearing you out or not, whatever the case may be, not feeling like at work you're making headway. God's actually still in that. As long as you continue to unite with him, he's present right there with you.
Mhm.
And I think that leads really nicely into verse 9, which we're going to crack open next time right here on Sons and Kings.
Why this tumult among nations, among peoples this useless murmuring? They arise, the kings of the earth. Princes plot against the Lord and his anointed. Come, let us break their fetters. Come, let us cast off their yoke. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord is laughing them to scorn. Then he will speak in his anger. His rage will strike them with terror. It is I who have set up my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will announce the decree of the Lord. The Lord said to me, you are my son. It is I who have begotten you this day. Ask, and I shall bequeath to you the nations. Put the ends of the earth in your possession. With a rod of iron you will break them, shatter them like a potter's jar. Now, O kings, understand. Take warning, rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with awe and trembling. Pay him your homage, lest he be angry and you perish. For suddenly his anger will blaze. Blessed are they who put their trust in God.
Hey, this is Jake. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Sons and Kings, the Psalm 2 show. We're really glad that you joined us today. We hope you got something out of it. And if you did, I'd love to invite you to share with a friend or even just like or subscribe to the platform. It really helps us to get the message out to more people, help more people with the show. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next episode.